Welcome back. The pandemic is changing the way our friends and neighbors get sober. Trends are also showing people misusing substances, and many may not be seeking help.
As Jim Spiewak reports tonight in tonight's Addicted Utah, officials have some big concerns over the pandemic's effect on use and treatment.
Yeah, and that's really forcing these addiction specialists to keep a very close eye on some of these emerging trends that they're seeing. And they tell me they would not be surprised if they saw an onslaught of those finally seeking treatment once things start to slow down from this pandemic. Under the Water is a place Curtis Young cannot be tempted by alcohol.
When you wake up, the first thing that's on your mind is that bottle.
Curtis loves diving, but his struggles with alcohol for most of his life has delayed his goal of being a master diver. He entered rehab back in February at the start of the pandemic.
Things have to change because of, safety as far as the virus goes.
At Odyssey House, where Curtis was getting treatment, people had to separate into small groups, and he met his therapist over Zoom, missing out on a lot of social connection.
That's the most dangerous part about this pandemic is, literally the opposite of addiction is connection.
Dr. Paula Cook, the chief medical officer at Odyssey, says isolation drives addiction, which makes this time period so risky.
We may be feeding another public health crisis that we continue to need to grow awareness around.
Another warning sign, overall admissions at Odyssey House are down.
It makes me really worried because I know people are still struggling with addiction, and they probably need treatment just like they did. In fact, maybe even more so. They're just not accessing it.
But at the same time, Odyssey reports they've seen nearly a 78% hike in people seeking treatment for alcohol misuse compared to the same time period last year.
Alcohol's widely available, it's accessible, it's socially acceptable. And so with that comes overusing, especially in this stressful, isolating time.
And it's not just alcohol. David Watkins, a prevention director with the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, is seeing a concerning trend with opioids here in Utah.
So some of the data that we have is the increase in non-fatal overdoses, those that are presenting to emergency departments, that has increased since the 1st of April.
Preliminary reports from the medical examiner's office show overdose deaths may increase as well.
Or the fatal overdoses haven't increased as much, but they are starting to trend in that way, and so we're going to keep our eye on it and see where it goes.
Watkins says connection is key in curbing these trends, which is something treatment centers like Odyssey are still trying to offer, even if it is just online.
And it may not quite be the same as meeting in person, but I think there's still a community to be gathered by being online, and you can still get good therapy.
Like Curtis has experienced, even though he still has not met his therapist face to face.
I am lucky enough now that I have a second chance at life.
Now, the medical examiner's office is monitoring very closely both fatal and non-fatal overdose data, and there is a report that is expected to be put out a little later this fall that'll show a little bit better correlation of exactly what is going on with respect to that right now during this pandemic. So that's something we are going to keep a very close eye on. Now, if you have any need to reach out, we have a ton of resources over on our website, KUTV.com. Just click on the Addicted Utah tab, and it was there that you will find a lot of resources for anyone that might be struggling with substance abuse right now.
And I started smoking the heroin. And the second I switched to heroin, it was over.
2 months after her first injection of heroin, Amy DAESCHEL was homeless.
It was me in that environment with my emotional trauma.
For 2 years, Amy knew two things. She wanted to get sober, and to do that, she needed help.
How long had it been when you first started asking for help to get clean before you got into treatment?
A year. It was a year.
Amy is like many other Utahns trying to get clean who reach out for help and get this same answer.
Nobody wants to say, we can help you, but we can't help you, right? So they just kept telling me to call back.
The want is there.
You're already at the lowest point of your life to begin with, and you're actually trying to make a change, right?
The treatment beds are available, but
we have such an extreme need for clinical providers here in Utah.
Which is exactly the reason why right now, First Step House Recovery Center has had 36 beds sit empty for the last year.
To what extent we'll be able to offer service, I can't say. We don't know if we're going to have all of the people that we need to run, this program at full force.
Jared Ferguson is the clinical director at First Step House. He started noticing difficulty hiring qualified clinicians about 3 years ago.
The truth of the matter is there's not a lot of incentive for people to come into the field.
The number of graduates colleges are turning out is lower than what's needed. Ferguson says Utah has 290 credentialed experts for every 100,000 people versus the national average of 312 for every 100,000 people.
We get asked by community partners, stakeholders, political figures, why we don't have people in those beds, and the short end of it is that we don't have helpers to help those in need.
The expansion of treatment services has spread the workforce thin, and expanded Medicaid has allowed more people without insurance to get help.
Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen stigma reduce and people feeling more comfortable saying, hey, you know what, I have a problem.
Adam Cohen is the CEO of Odyssey House, another treatment center. He says getting a graduate degree in the field is expensive.
Weiler.
But funding was recently approved last legislative session, offering student loan forgiveness and increased number of Master of Social Work spots at the University of Utah.
So that is going to have a tremendous impact on people entering the workforce, and that's fantastic.
That's if the students come, which is something Amy hopes happens for those wanting, yet still waiting.
You would do anything to find your next fix. You would walk 10 miles in the snow. You would wait 4 hours for your dealer. Nothing got in your way for your next fix. That is how you need to fight for your life back.
Reporting in Salt Lake City, Jim Spiewak, 2 News. Reversing an overdose usually requires 1 or 2 doses of Narcan. In the last few days, Georgia Gregersen has saved 2 people's lives and has needed a lot more than just 2 doses to do it.
The first one took 5, the second one took 7.
7 doses of reversal medicine on 1 person.
It's remarkably strong stuff that these people are using.
Georgia works for a needle exchange program, and she says her clients have recently been talking a lot more about a spike in overdoses.
We don't know exactly what we're dealing with at this moment, but we are definitely attempting to find out.
That's crazy uncommon, and it's actually incredibly concerning.
MINDY Vincent helps run a needle exchange program. They've identified at least 9 incidents where 21 doses of Narcan were needed.
It tells us there's a bad batch of dope around, for sure.
MINDY can't assume it's the powerful drug fentanyl, but she is seeing fentanyl test positive in other drugs like heroin.
To be able to surprise or shock seasoned veterans of this kind of work, that says something about what's going on.
MINDY says without more research, it's impossible to know if there is something more to this bad batch.
You know, we don't know for sure. And without proper drug testing, like they have in other countries, we won't know for sure.
I drank every day for most of my life, starting at age 13.
His face is well known in Utah. Randall Carlisle anchored the evening news for years.
When I'd be saying, thanks for watching, good night, have a good night, or whatever, my mind would be saying, it's time to drink.
That's what most people didn't know. He calls himself a functioning alcoholic.
I was all in from the beginning. I always drank to get drunk.
Randall says he didn't drink before work or during his shift, just at night when he got home.
I would drink probably every night 10 to 20 beers before I'd go to sleep.
The drinking impacted his personal life. He was married and divorced 4 times.
I separated the two. I would say I'm successful professionally, I'm horribly unsuccessful personally, but it's probably their fault. But it wasn't. It was my fault.
So we're really not looking to see it.
Dr. Corey Rich is an expert in chemical dependency. He has seen stories like Randall's in all walks of life.
There's not a population that isn't impacted by this disease.
He says someone who is addicted can seem to function normally at work or in family events at first.
Submerged underneath that facade or that functionality is a dependence upon a chemical or a behavior.
But once they progress to dependence, priorities change.
We use the word obsession. Every effort is made to orient and strategically work around the ability to have access to that substance.
Rich says there are signs like making excuses, isolation, losing interest in hobbies, or spending more time away from home.
They continue to use despite negative consequences.
And Randall can relate. At a point when he was not working in TV, he says he drank full time.
It got so bad that I had to drink 3 or 4 beers in the morning so I could shave because my hands were shaking so bad.
That's when he realized he needed help.
So you've heard the pitch already.
So he went through treatment and is now almost 8 years sober. He is off the air and works with Odyssey House, a treatment program.
It's more fulfilling than any job I ever had in TV because I feel like I'm part of an organization that helps people reclaim their lives.
Dr. Rich says realizing what matters can help someone who is addicted start to change. They don't have to wait until they hit rock bottom.
They just have to heighten their level of awareness and see that what they're doing is not bringing the things that they really want in their life.
That self-realization can happen with family support and treatment. After putting in all that work, Randall says he's never been happier.
It's just so nice not to have a life that has to center around alcohol.
When you become addicted, it changes the way you function within your world.
Jen Harris used drugs the majority of her life, and even in recovery, substance use affects her every day.
I have to wake up, admit that I'm powerless, that there's an issue, ask for help, and then help somebody else.
When she got sober, Jen didn't have a phone or even an ID. It was tough finding a job or a place to live.
So just those barriers alone is enough to make you just want to give up.
It's a common story for others like her, but the law may help. Substance use disorder can be recognized as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Fair Housing Act, and Rehabilitation Act, but only if a person is not currently using illegal drugs.
So if you simply quietly go home and drink too much at night, that doesn't disqualify you.
Disability law professor Leslie Francis says substance use disorder requires a medical diagnosis, but once diagnosed, it protects you from discrimination in employment and housing.
The idea that, quote, it's a lifestyle or a choice is just wrong.
An employer has to give a person time off to go to recovery meetings or other treatment, and a landlord cannot use past substance abuse as a reason not to rent, but it can be easy to lose that protection.
But if I relapse just once on my medication-assisted treatment, I lose that accommodation right. And that's what's troubling.
And if you are deemed a risk to others, you also lose the protection. Stereotyping has been illegal in the U.S. since the late 1980s, but Leslie says it can still happen.
So we need to shift our paradigms to think about substance use disorders as health problems.
When discrimination does happen, it's on the disabled person to prove the burden, which can be timely, costly, and stressful.
Just imagine what life would be like if you had a disability and you couldn't even get housing because people wouldn't rent to you because they said, oh, she's got a disability, so I'm afraid of her.
That's what happened with Jen. When she finally found a house to rent, it wasn't a safe situation.
I reported over and over again that there's a leak and there's an electricity problem.
The house eventually caught fire and Jen's family lost everything.
I can't believe I made it. Because it was hard.
She's in a much better situation today, but she hopes attitudes will change to help people like her have a smoother transition into their new life.
There needs to be an understanding that it is a disability, that it's not a moral issue. It's not that I'm a bad person, but that it literally is a disability.
Joe Estes grew up around drugs and alcohol.
Telling myself I would never go that route. I would never end up being like that too, you know.
But he started using at an early age, and that led to a heroin addiction. He knew getting sober was not going to be easy.
My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest, and I'm like, oh my God. Oh, wow. Here we go.
3.5 years later, Joe is still clean, but he relies on a regular dose of methadone for pain management and to control relapsing.
Withdrawals just like the flu. You know, I mean, it feels like you're going to die, and, you know, because it's just people that pass away from their withdrawal.
But getting more than a single dose of medicine is rare. That is unless a bill on medication-assisted treatment, also known as MAT, making its way through Congress right now, passes.
We're so careful the way we prescribe these medications, but sometimes a little too careful.
Congressman John Curtis is not the sponsor, but supports the bill that would allow someone to get 3 days of methadone or Suboxone instead of just 1 dose.
And some of them turn back to the drugs that brought them there, and so we're trying to fix that problem.
The bill's focus is for people right after an overdose that go to an ER, and the aim is to give them enough medicine until they can get into treatment.
You know, this is one thing that somebody can be living under a bridge, 1 week, and then, and 2 weeks later, they're like functioning and working.
Carol Sheen Powell, the director of recovery with Four Corners Behavioral Health, says MAT essentially eliminates withdrawal symptoms. But what's lacking, according to a Gardner Policy Institute study, is MAT availability in Utah, specifically in rural areas. Powell says her clinic is the only MAT program in the Four Corners area, covering Emery and Carbon counties.
My clinic is so busy since we've opened. We have overshot the number of patients that we initially set out to serve.
Out to serve people like Joe, who is not afraid to say sometimes he needs a little extra help.
I think it's important that people treat people that are in recovery with a little bit of trust. Yeah, definitely save lives. Like I said, methadone saved my life, for sure.
I struggled for the better half of 20 years, just trying to forgive myself for what I had done.
It's a decision made decades ago that few have sympathy for. This lifetime registered sex offender, who we are not identifying, was convicted of lewd and lascivious behavior with a young girl.
I can only pray and hope that I didn't create the damage that I could have.
He says at the time he was always drunk and high. The plan that night was to commit suicide, but he passed out, which is how the police found him.
It ruined my life.
After prison, he went right back to abusing drugs and alcohol. But he finally reached a point years later where he wanted to get sober.
But with my background the way it is, it's hard for me to comprehend that I will get that help.
It took him 3 years to get into a substance abuse treatment inpatient program, proving help does not come easy for the 7,800 registered sex offenders here in Utah.
Some of these guys I worked with for 17 years, and it's only in the last 2 years that they've been clean and sober, just because treatment wasn't available this entire time for them.
Tim Kiefer's job is to help the roughly 1,000 offenders in Salt Lake get services to stay compliant with the rules of the sex offender registry.
We can get them all the benefits that they need except for substance abuse treatment, and if that's their major barrier, then they're kind of stuck in this rut for 15 years.
Tim says geographic restrictions limit where sex offenders can get higher levels of treatment, which many times are in neighborhoods or near schools. And many centers won't take them in because their address would then pop up on the sex offender registry.
It's a massive challenge.
Many treatment plans also thrive in group settings, and introducing a sex offender can get tricky. With these hurdles, Tim has to try to convince a facility to let them in. And part of his pitch is they are more closely monitored. They're off the streets, not using or re-victimizing.
The more successful somebody is, the least, the less likely they're going to be to offend.
Jared Ferguson, the clinical director of First Step House Recovery, says the more severe the crime, the less likely it can be to get treatment.
People need community support in order to stay sober. And I would offer that the same thing is true of sex offenses.
There's not good record keeping of how many sex offenders are turned away from treatment, but studies show allowing public access to the registry discourages compliance with the registry. Ferguson says another challenge is finding staff who are qualified to treat someone who needs substance use and sex offender therapy.
Because sometimes when we treat people incorrectly, we actually end up making them worse.
Which has not been the case for the sex offender we talked to. He doesn't know if his victim will ever forgive him for his horrible decision, so he's focusing on what he can control, staying sober.
I had to completely change my mindset in order to follow a right path in recovery.
And it's a much better way to get somebody help, and it's immediate.
Bountiful Police Chief Tom Ross has an idea. Send someone battling substance abuse or mental health issues to treatment instead of jail or the courts.
We're starting them down a path that is positive to treatment instead of negative to treatment.
People facing a low-level misdemeanor that does not involve violence or restitution are eligible for this program. If they go to and stay committed to treatment and sobriety, charges are not even filed against them.
They're kind of taken back by this and almost aren't sure whether they should believe us.
Police bring people to this Davis County Receiving Center where nurses, therapists, and peer support staff are here 24/7 to
assess them, evaluate them, and get them to the appropriate treatment program.
Dr. Todd SOUTOR is a psychologist with Davis Behavioral Health, a partner in the program. He says stressful situations can drive addiction.
And we want to help people build skills and tools to be able to game plan against that and combat those times of temptation and those times of difficulty.
Which is exactly what Shaun White has been going through lately.
Addiction is a really, really disgusting thing. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
White is not facing any charges right now, but the day we spoke with him, he had used drugs the night before and voluntarily came in for a second time.
If you're going to come here, make sure that you come here and you give it your all, because this place, they'll give you their all. You just got to be willing to do it for yourself.
Since December, 64 people have sought treatment. More than half would have otherwise gone to jail. Another 28% would have filled up emergency room beds, which is all the chief needs to see if anyone says this is a waste of taxpayer money or not being tough enough on crime.
That says that they're off the streets and they're not doing drugs during that time and they're not having a mental health crisis.